Again, welcome to this webinar. Very excited for you all to be here. Very excited for Alicia to be here and kind of help us out and have this conversation. This is our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a Methodology for Success webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone who is here will also get a copy of that recording in a post-event email, as long as with some resources and stuff that Alicia's gonna be sharing with us and that we've collected here at Gusto as well. So excited to get all that out to you. But without further ado, let's do some introductions. If you've been to these before, you know who I am. My name is Noah Warder. I'm the head of people here over at Gusto. You're not actually here to see me. You're here to see Alicia and listen to her and her expertise. So I'll let her do her introduction because she can do it much better than I can. So Alicia, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Noah. And of course, people are here to see you too. Come on, give yourself some credit. Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia Campbell. I'm the founder and CEO of Culture Shift HR, which is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy firm where I help with clients and different organizations focus on creating inclusive culture with an employee-first lens. So super excited to be here to answer your questions, get into the nitty-gritty of DE&I, and be a partner.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So before we get into the conversation, before we start chatting about all the things you're here, we got a little poll for y'all to fill out for us. And so I'm going to launch this right now. And so this is to kind of get a gauge of like where everyone's at, where, you're all coming from. So if you could take, a couple seconds, answer that for us. So Alicia and I kind of know where you're coming from. Then we can understand, what we can speak to and what you're looking to learn here today, and where you're at in your DE&I journey with your organization. So let's give it another couple seconds. We're at 75%. All right. I'd love to get into that 85% participation rate. All right, we're getting there.
Yeah, it's like a race.
Yeah. Who's gonna finish first? Yeah. No, everyone wants to be first, right? No one wants to be last. No. So my 5-year-old keeps telling me.
Competitive.
Oh, so competitive. Cannot be last for anything.
Oh.
Up the stairs, in the house. Wait, I could take about another 5 seconds. All right, great. So about 87% of participation rate. Awesome, thank you so much. Let's share these results. So it kind of looks like the number one thing that people, knowing where to start. Not very surprising, but knowing where to start. Budget, limited resources, time, and then the second one is all of the above.
All of the above, yeah.
How do you even tackle this very large thing? And so that's why we have Alicia here. Tell us where to start.
Yeah, no, that's great start off point. And thanks everybody for participating, because it's to acknowledge that DE&I is difficult is even difficult in and of itself, because I think when workplaces were like, this is something we want to really be focused on and really make it, move the needle on, there just became this enormous amount of pressure, like, okay, doing the things and having all the KPIs and making sure we're creating all these social groups and ERGs. Like it just became like this mountain of work that, I think a lot of HR practitioners who aren't as familiar in this space were like, okay, where do I even start? And I also have a whole other job to do as well. So I totally get it, totally know where you're coming from. I think when it comes to where do I start first, it's so key that you kind of start with, what are we trying to achieve? It seems like a simple question, but there are so many layers to it. So if you kind of break down, like, what are we trying to achieve? Really what you want to understand is where ultimately are we trying to drive the D&I strategy of the organization? So are we trying to increase diversity within our hiring? Are we trying to have more equitable policies and programs, maybe with gender pay gaps or with hiring? Are we looking to create more of a programmal type of framework where we're looking at creating ERGs or different committees? So I think just starting to brainstorm, figuring out some ideas. Don't worry about timeline. Don't worry about resources or who's going to do the what and the when, but just what we want to do and achieve. And then I think from there, you're going to get a really good baseline of where do we want to really start to aim and start to guide and direct a lot of the work and ideas we have. And then from there, you can really start to build out your plan and identify those other key principles of resources, time, skill sets, all those key things. But it's even asking yourself the one question of what do we want to see achieved, and getting the alignment from the leadership team is the starting place you want to get to.
Awesome. And who should be in that conversation of like, what do we want to achieve? When do you bring in that leadership team or those executives or your CEO or your founders, depending on, how big your company is, like, do you bring them in for that initial conversation, or is it, more the people team kind of figuring out what do we want to achieve and then taking that to the leadership team or the executives? Like, what do you see works best? What do you think drives the most buy-in, or is it kind of different for every organization?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think it's definitely going to be a little bit different. Some founders and leaders are very involved. They are really in kind of the day-to-day, and some of them are a little bit more removed. So I would say if you're in the HR team or you're leading your HR kind of piece within your business, you know your leadership team best. You know how to make things palatable for them. You know how to get the most buy-in. So I would say use your superpowers and kind of identify what that like perfect melody looks like. But I think ultimately what you want to do is you want to always present or give at least some type of outline to a meeting with the leadership team. So I think from an HR perspective, talking about why D&I is important, the ROI, whether it's increased retention, engagement, innovation, growth, all kind of the key elements and KPIs with ROI, which are with diversity, which are really easy to find online. And then kind of talking about what you envision kind of seeing within the organization and kind of taking that kind of first step with it. Bring that plan to the leadership team and kind of present to them your plan like you would with any other project. So it's okay, this is what we want to achieve. Are you aligned? Should we be looking at this from a different facet? What are the different elements we need to be looking to make this come to life? Whether again, it's training, resources, time, etc. And then just bringing them along for the journey, which is key, because at the end of the day, the leadership, whether they're involved from a very key perspective or they're a little bit more hands-off, they need to be bought in 100%. And the reason that that's key is because it all starts from the top. If you're creating incredible grassroots initiatives, you're having events or trainings and seminars, but your leadership isn't showing up, your leadership isn't speaking to the great work, there's going to be a massive disconnect. So making sure that they continue to be along the journey in whatever shape and form that looks like is going to make sure that not only is your plan have that executive leadership oversight, but it also has that sustainability and that longevity, because it's something that's key to the strategic elements of the business.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And like, I know that's always like one of the biggest things that I've heard from our clients and from just friends in the HR community is like, how do I get my executive team on board? What do I do? What do I do when I get pushback on this? Or what do I do when it's like, well, this isn't a priority for our organization? Though I think that's the number one thing I hear a lot of is like, how do you address that? Well, this isn't a priority for us, or like, great, just do it on the candidate experience, or like just diversify our candidate pipeline. It's like, well, how do you answer that question? That's just really one piece of the puzzle, but we really need to make it a priority because it encompasses everything.
Yeah, absolutely, Noah. So it's totally disheartening. I mean, I've been in that seat so many times, and I still do with some clients I work with. And it's like you want to do so much. There's so much to do. The impact. All the the key results. You could probably rehearse them off by hand because of your research and your dedication to this. So when it comes to that conversation and you get that type of pushback, I think it's one thing to understand, knowing that the business has so many priorities, is where can we meet the business where it's at, but still make an impact. So if right now it's just diversifying our recruitment pipeline, let's do that, but let's do the best we can absolutely do. And then from there, build and build and build. And so I think if that's all you're getting at this point in time, figuring out, okay, if this is all the playground I have, how can we optimize this to the best of our ability? So how could we look at our processes? How are we looking at our job descriptions? What tools are we using? How are we doing interviewing training to ensure that when we're interviewing candidates, there's no bias involved? How are we assessing candidates? So there's still a lot of work, even in just looking at the recruitment element of diversity as well. So it's definitely no small feat to do a recruitment audit, to build out those key pieces and then revamp and retrain, the whole business on that. So even if that is one checkbox you have for, say, the next year, that is one that will still keep you very busy and still make an enormous impact on the business. I think from there, the second piece is continuing to use that little piece that you have and building the business case for more work. So when you start to see the more diversity coming in, when you start to see better engagement, cleaner processes, more equitable practices, you can then say, hey, look at all these now new results we're seeing. Now we need to do some DE&I training. Now we need to get the management and the leadership to understand what it means to manage a diverse workforce, what it means to be equitable in our performance review practices, or whatever that looks like. So use it as a launching pad to continue to to build out the framework because you focused and did such a great job even within the recruitment pieces.
Yeah, that's great advice, and I love it. And like the way I've talked about it with some friends of mine and some other HR executives is like, if that's your starting off point, is like diversify your candidate pipeline and all that kind of stuff. And then if your leadership team kind of pushes back, like, well, we don't have time for this. It's like, well, we just hired all these people. If we don't do these other things,
Exactly,
we're going to lose them all. So all that work you just had me do will go to waste. And so 100%. It's like you can, like, you just had me spend all this money and all this time doing this great thing that we did. But if we don't keep going, this is just going to go to the wayside and go wasted. And then we'll lose all of this investment that we put into it. So 100%. I think that's the other key piece of like, there's a little bit of that fear factor that you can put into those executives as well.
Absolutely.
We just got a quick question from Patricia in the chat. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll answer them as we kind of go along. But framework you can recommend to guide that initial conversation to ensure we're thinking about DE&I the right way and guide the conversation on what we should achieve. Where do you start? I think you talked about this a little bit of just like really focusing on like what's the first thing you want to achieve, what's the first thing as an organization you want to do. I don't think there is a right way because every organization is going to be a little bit different and going to have their own way to do this. There's definitely wrong ways to do it, but I don't think there's one right way. But any frameworks that you've seen or are kind of out in the wild that you think work really well, Alicia?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think one tool that I've been seeing leveraged a lot is engagement surveys. So a lot of organizations, whether twice a year, once a year, they do some type of engagement surveys, and engagement surveys now do have some type of diversity or DE&I question or section. So use that as maybe just a starting point. So say, for example, your diversity metrics within the engagement survey are lower than the rest of this combined survey results. What is it that the comments or the results are telling us about our diversity practices? That can be a lot of information, a lot of ideas, and kind of a starting point. Because again, it ties right back to the engagement and ties right back into how the rest of your staff are feeling in the business. So I think that's a really good place to start in terms of just getting those ideas, seeing what the pain points are, and then creating a plan and a strategy specifically focused on that. And then in terms of guiding the conversation, finding key metrics and also specifically to your industry and the work you do regarding DE&I, I think is so pivotal. Leaders love data. They love understanding the value that something is going to have as an outcome. So, finding some key resources, there's tons of great white papers, studies from various, verifiable organizations that can speak to how important DE&I is to an organization at all various levels, whether it's HR, leadership, growth, strategy, innovation, and then use those key points to kind of draft your narrative in terms of pitching or relaying back the importance of DE&I along with the plan, so they can go hand in hand and you can get that buy-in.
Awesome, great, love it. And I think like one metric that you could probably talk about that is on every leader's mind and every HR people person's mind is retention right now. So you could that's an easy like piece of data that you can pull out is like retention. And also just if you diversify your candidate pipeline, that's just that many more people that you can then hire to your organization. And hiring and talent acquisition and retention is the hardest thing right now. And so if you want one data point that you can focus on, go look at retention rates, go look on engagement, go look on candidate pipeline, and do all that. And then I think Rita's question kind of plays quite well into this next one, which is executive sponsorship. What does this mean? And what does a successful executive sponsorship actually look like? You talked a bit about like leadership buy-in, make sure they're all bought in and they're kind of showing up, but can you expand a bit on that of like, what does it truly mean for an executive to really buy into the mission of DE&I at their organization?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Rita. When we say sponsorship, it's really having that executive presence involved in not only the strategy, but also the plan and the activation of the DE&I programming. So they would be attending meetings, they would be being there for feedback or insight. They would relay any details back to the rest of the C-suite or the leadership team. They would really be your advocate to other senior leaders in the business, and also spotlighting and giving space and opportunity for the DE&I D&I committee or the HR team that's overseeing this great work to ensure that it gets the acknowledgement and the space it needs to kind of get some legs and kind of really have some velocity. So they're really there to be a champion, they're there to be a resource, and they're there to make sure that the voices of what is going on is being amplified throughout the rest of the business. And in terms of a successful executive sponsor, there's someone who truly cares about the work. They're there because they themselves might have experienced discrimination in the workplace. They understand the importance of diversity. They, push through a lot of barriers themselves, maybe being either a woman or someone from an underrepresented group, and say, listen, this is not what I want an experience of someone to be like in the organization. I'm going to work with the team and kind of make this better. So utilize me, my time, my resources to make sure that you're getting the support you need in this area. And so someone who's wanting to be all in, spending the extra time and being there to support is someone who looks like a really good sponsor.
Awesome. Yeah. And I want to expand a little bit on that of like, I think what's super important here is you talked about is the visibility of an executive actually caring is so powerful and showing up, like just that visibility of like your frontliners seeing like, oh, the CEO is here. That means this is important. Or the head of sales is here. That means this is important to them. That sort of walking the talk is such an important piece for really any initiative that you put in 100%. As a people leader, but especially with the DE&I, because if, like you said, if the leadership's not on board, if they're not showing up, then why will anyone else really care about the program? So there's one more thing that HR is trying to do that it's just like, come on.
Amongst the many thousand of things we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's the other thing. And it brings me to another point that I want to kind of touch on is like, HR and people professionals are being asked to do more and more and more than ever, especially since the pandemic came on. And DE&I is just one more of those things. And like a lot of us, myself included, feel a little bit out of our element. Like I've never been trained in this. I have kind of no idea what I'm doing. What resources do you recommend people go just to learn about best practices and how to communicate DE&I initiatives to their teams? Because I think that's an important thing, is that communication piece of like, how do you talk about it with your internal communications channels with your teams as well?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Noah. It is a lot, 100%. We've really had to step up, elevate, learn, wear multiple hats at any given time, and just be the person the go-to for a lot of key kind of things that have been going on. I think, especially if you're a one-person team, when it comes to HR or your people operation, coming to things like this webinar, similar types of webinars are so key, because you're going to get really key information, shared resources, insights, and you'll be able to walk away to say, okay, I have one or two kind of steps that I can action this week, this month, and kind of get some support or get some traction on. So you're going to leave away with that quick hit and get that insight. And I think second is there's, again, tons of resources, white papers. A lot of organizations are publishing their own DE&I results from doing yearly surveys and analyses. So utilize those resources as a benchmark for what you're doing for plans, and using them as a comparison, for using them for any key data points. And so I think the key thing here is working smarter, not harder. Even in the limited time that we may have for DE&I initiatives, it's how could we utilize the times we're either in webinars or in trainings and finding, these great white papers and resources to find the information we need to learn, and as well as advance the communication of DE&I in the workplace. And then I think second to that, given that this does usually live within the HR kind of realm, is if you have a Slack channel or group channel where you could share resources, share as much content as you can, because if you're talking more about it and helping others learn, it's going to help create more of an organic conversation, so that it doesn't always feel like you're pulling teeth trying to get, this conversation off the ground. It will just kind of happen more naturally.
That's great. I love it. And yeah, I think that organic conversation is super, super important. And thank you, Nas, for dropping that link into the chat. We'll also have other resources and links that we'll share in the email that's going to go out after the webinar. So look forward to those as well. So when it comes to that sort of organic conversation, there's always those moments where you might have one or two or multiple employees that push back and say, why do we need this? Aren't we already doing all the things? Why do I have to care about this thing or whatnot? How do you recommend people deal with those types of situations? Because those are often the most difficult and also the most scary to people in the HR professional roles. And we're like, oh God, I got to like go and talk to this person now about why what they're saying is not okay.
Yeah. No, those are always tricky situations to be in, and probably not are the favorite part of our jobs. But I think what's important is that one thing we need to understand, and it's probably something everyone can relate to that's here today, is that we're all at different inflection points of our DE&I learning journey. And the way that I like to relate to DE&I is that it's learning a new skill, it's learning a new language. In the beginning, if we're learning French or any other type of language other than English, or even English, it takes a minute to kind of get the vernacular, to get the tonality, to understand the context of certain phrases and different idioms. It's the exact same thing with DE&I. So knowing that everyone either hasn't heard of it, isn't very familiar with it, or may not even be that interested, there's going to be different ways that we have to meet people where they're at. And I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to creating a DE&I framework that allows people to come along for the journey. No one wants to ever feel like they're being pulled or pushed. They want to feel like, we're going to meet you where you are, but we're going to, encourage you to kind of continue our learning journey together. And so I think when those conversations come up, what's really key is just having a conversation to say, hey, like, what is it that worries you about DE&I? Is there anything I can provide from a clarity perspective or from a learning perspective? And just asking them simple questions and really hearing them out. I think a lot of people do get a little bit nervous about DE&I and saying the wrong things, thinking the wrong things, or not approaching it from the perfect way. And I think there isn't a perfect way. It's how can we as humans just be better at understanding what inclusive language is, or understanding what equity versus equality looks like, and just simple things that we just don't interact with every day. And learning them allows us to then build up that muscle of DE&I. And so I think just sharing, listening, providing an ear, having kind of like a quick hit list of resources, so that if someone has questions, you can say, hey, check out these books or these podcasts, these articles, and just making it easier and accessible for them, I think starts to get people more attuned and more open to these conversations. And then last on this point, I think if people are just not wanting to engage, I think, as much as we would wish everybody was understanding, sometimes people are just not there yet. And I think just giving them that space and that respect and letting them know if they have questions, they can always come to you.
That's awesome. Great. I love that point about like DE&I as a skill. That's something that you got to practice. We're not all going to be good at it right away. It's a growth, like you're growing there. It's like listening. It's like gratitude. It's something you got to practice day in and day out. So I love that. I love it. That's great. Awesome. We've got another one from Imran. I hope I'm pronouncing your name wrong or right. And I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. But we have an EDI council set up, but struggling to make the best use of our time. What ways would you suggest to structure the goals of the EDI council to be efficient and working positively?
That's a great question. EDI councils are so key, and they are such a strong pillar with any EDI strategy or framework. And the reason that I say that is because those who are doing the work, those who are invested or want to, participate, they need to have a space to come together to talk, to share, to ideate. And so EDI councils are so key in making sure that the strategy or the direction is actually kind of manifesting and kind of coming to life. To the question, I think what's key in ensuring that the time you're using is as maximized as possible is understanding what as an EDI council are we trying to achieve. So very similar question to what's our strategy. It's okay, say the organization's goal is to increase diversity by 10% by the end of the year. As an EDI council, what can we do to attribute to that larger goal? So for example, maybe it's awareness, making sure people are more aware on the key foundations of DE&I. And so maybe that's bringing in a speaker series. That could be starting a media club, and every month or every quarter you read a new book, a new podcast, a new article, and then discuss it and have some talking points. Maybe it's understanding and researching different cultures and presenting and sharing those kind of key ideologies. It could be something so small, but so powerful, because a lot of it when it comes from EDI is knowledge, it's sharing. And if we're been so closed off and not leading with our curiosity to understand what even our diversity dimensions can look like, we can do so much by imparting that knowledge to others and really then sharing what it is amongst the rest of the organization. So I think it's understanding where you can have the power and the control to make that influence, starting small and then building out to what that, those goals could look like to align it back to the larger strategy.
Cool. Well, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you, Imran, for that question. For those who don't have a council set up or don't have ERGs or so employee resource groups or, other labels for the same thing, what do you find is what's the sort of inflection point that a company can actually start setting those up? Like, you're not necessarily going to have an ERG or ERG groups when you're a size 25 or 50. What point do you usually see those starting to pop up within an organization, or when they have the most benefit? And what are the best practices around ERG groups? I keep saying groups, and G is another rating group, but what are the best practices for that? Because like it can be done really badly, where you're like, ERG for our Black employees, I want you to do all this extra work, but we're not going to give you an extra time or an extra compensation to do that. Where that's just you're asking for a lot of unpaid labor, part of a group that's already providing a lot of unpaid labor. So what are the best practices? What do you think the things that HR professionals can do to support their ERGs or their EDI councils, and how can we make it so that they're actually effective within the organization?
Really good points. So I think first, in terms of size, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a cap or a minimum of an employee groups. Like I would say if you're 20 plus employees, you're going to find some commonality within your employee base. So whether that's a group for parents, for women, for your Black employees, underrepresented employees, having groups to support one another within your culture, I think is always a great idea. So I think, it doesn't necessarily need to meet a threshold. I think it's just if coming together allows for that psychological safety, allows for an opportunity for good conversation and a space to be seen, I always encourage that. Second, with HR professionals, if you're looking to create and kind of structure your ERG or EID council framework, what you want to do is you want to provide a little bit of an outline of how to set those up successfully. So what does that look like? So one, you want to make sure that the group is coming together for a key purpose that aligns back to the organization. And this is really key because what we don't want to create is social groups. And that's kind of what can happen if ERGs are not really set up in a way that can have influence and can start to, be activated in the space that they're trying to make some change in. So it's important that if there's an ERG group that they're aligned to a purpose that the organization is looking to enhance, looking to drive the needle forward, or looking to add to the DE&I strategy. I think from there, it's understanding, okay, how can we provide some structure so that the time the ERG participants come together, it's valuable. So maybe having someone who's a chair or a co-chair to lead, to outline the meetings, getting an executive sponsor to ensure that there's that connectivity to the leadership team and the ERG. And then third is you want to get them to have at least one goal that they're working towards for that year. So what is it that they want to improve or achieve within the business, whether it's maybe doing helping with the culture survey or starting an event series or a speaker series, and if they're going to do that, again, what's the value back to the business? And that value piece is key because that's kind of what differentiates, say, a social group, people who just want to get together and support versus actually starting to empower and utilize the resources within to move the business forward. And what's really important as well with the ERGs is that, to your point, Noah, it can be very laborious intensive. We're spending a lot of time, we're already working a lot of hours. I would highly encourage our HR professionals to see if we can give some type of compensation. It may not have to be monetary. Maybe it's an extra vacation day. Maybe it's an opportunity to go to a conference or do some type of professional development event of some nature. So it doesn't always need to be monetary from that perspective, although of course that helps. But if the organization isn't in a place to do that, what are some other creative ways that we can also show appreciation and thanks for the time that our ERGs spend together and for the business?
That's great. I think I like that you brought up the other ways, because so often it's just about money, and money is not always the best way to recognize and kind of reward and kind of make sure that we're talking to our employees and making it equitable. And that kind of bring up to one of the points I wanted to chat about was recognition in the workplace is so important, especially now that we're all remote, but recognition and equitable recognition across the organization, and making sure that, your managers or your leaders or, your teams are feeling recognized kind of across the team, regardless of, their race or ethnicity or their background or, what team they're on and whatnot. You don't want your, maybe I'm going to use the classic example of like your sales team is getting all the recognition because they're bringing in the big deals, they're ringing the bell, they're making the most noise. And then you've got your developers or your customer support team who are like, well, what about us? Like we do so much important work. Like we're the ones that are dealing with the customers day in, day out. Yes, you bring them in, but we're the ones that make sure that they stay here. Why don't we get as much love? So what do you see are best practices in making sure that all employees across the organization, and how do you kind of like build that into a DE&I program or philosophy?
Yeah, no, I love that perspective. Recognition is so key. And I think to your point of, we're in a pandemic, we're all virtual. We all are maybe not as connected as we were once upon a time ago. The smallest recognition can mean so much. And I think there's so many days where we're just feeling burnt out. We're feeling like we're just at our end, but we just keep pushing and we keep going. And so I think what's key to when we think of recognition and equitability is we all recognize recognition differently. For me, it might be a higher compensation. For someone else, it might be that extra vacation day they can take and, have an extra long weekend with their family. I think what's important is that leaders begin to utilize different platforms, different initiatives to outline how can we identify what are the different ways we can recognize, and then how do we encourage those to actually participate in the recognition. And so that's the really key piece, because even if we started to create all these different ways of, recognizing someone, rewarding really great work, if they're not taking advantage of it, then we're not meeting that other half of the equation. So how are we giving the space or the time or the resources for that recognition to actually kind of be executed and manifested? So is it, how are we educating on the importance of taking time off? How are we educating and sharing more platforms and different tools on how to reward even peer-to-peer and recognition from that way as well? And so I think that could be really important, and just doing some research, finding out what everybody would appreciate from a recognition perspective, and not just doing a one size fits all, and just taking that extra little bit of time to make sure that that recognition is meaningful and can actually be utilized.
Oh, I love that. And it comes back to like that listening piece of like, you need to listen to your people, see what they want, what they need. And like also recognizing how that recognition should be shared, because some people don't want to be in the limelight. They don't want to have that shout out on the company-wide Slack channel or at the all hands meeting. That petrifies them, and they're like, oh God, why are we doing this right now? And other people love it. They love it. But so recognizing how people want to be recognized from like a monetary standpoint or non-monetary standpoint, but also how you communicate that recognition is also super important.
Exactly.
People where their needs are. So awesome. We got a great question from George in the Q&A, which is, my company has a great start, solid leadership commitment. What are some strategies for helping employees overcome their discomfort and with their internal biases and encouraging buy-in at the ground level? So you've got your leadership, you've kind of hit that first step. And you're like, okay, I got my leadership team. We've got a program in place. We're ready to go. Now let's bring the rest of the company on board. How do you do that next step?
Yeah. So the next step, and something that I always encourage a lot of my clients to do, is the education piece. And when we think about education or training, we just from other experiences we may have had with other learnings or L&D elements, it could seem quite boring or maybe dry. So I think what's important is when we think about DE&I learning, understand what type of culture that your organization has to be receptive to the different various types of training that are out there. You could do something live, you could do something that's hybrid between live and an online platform. You can have virtual. There are incredible options nowadays when it comes to training. And so I think training gets everybody on kind of the same track and the same pathway. And the reason is because it's nerve-wracking, or it can be a little bit scary to go into the deep and say, okay, I want to now do D&I, or I don't know what I'm doing, and feeling like you're the odd one out. But by having an organizational training and starting to bring everybody together to learn at the same type of pace, you're starting to create that openness and that safety regarding the topic. And so then that allows for people to want to learn more, ask questions, participate, and really kind of get that engagement a little bit higher. So that's 100% what I recommend. Number two, and maybe even just doing a small survey, like what what do you want to learn about DE&I? What maybe makes you a little bit nervous about the topic? What do you want to learn more about or have questions about that you don't know who to ask? Because then you can take those key points and then feed them to whomever is facilitating to make sure that those elements are getting addressed, but there's still that anonymity aspect if, people aren't kind of comfortable, sharing their questions in front of everybody else. And then I think with the internal biases point, what's really funny about biases is that everybody has them. So we're actually born, fun fact, we're actually born with biases. It's how we actually learn the different ways of the world around us. So the way that our brains work is through patterns, through habits. And so as we're growing up through adolescence, teenage years to adulthood, our brains are constantly creating new habits and taking in new information, which is actually a bias. And so what happens with unconscious bias is that through different unvalidated information and media and all the different types of information we take in every day, our cognitive brainwaves of how we make decisions and effectiveness are then clouded with inactual and not true statements or assumptions. And then when we lean into our biases, because we're working so fast, we don't take that time to question or even to think, is what I'm thinking, what I'm saying, and what I'm doing actually the right thing? So I say that and show everybody today because it's okay that we have biases. And the more we are aware of our biases, that's when we could start to utilize tools, anti-bias assessments, learning, reading, whatever that looks like, so we don't lean into the bias. But we all have them. And by learning, that's how we actually overcome them and then create new patterns and new cognitive brainwaves so that we don't continue to do more things that damage interactions with other people.
That's great. And I think I want to just re-highlight a couple of key points of the safety. I think that's so important, is creating a safe place. And this is for all people of we're all going to make mistakes and that's okay. And and I think stating that up front to your whole organization of look, we're all on this journey together. We're all going to make mistakes and that's okay, as long as you're open to having your mistakes kind of pointed out and learning from them. That's the kind of the key point there. Listening and being prepared to listen. And like you said, kind of pausing a moment and being is my internal assumption here really accurate? And should I maybe take a step back and reassess the situation here?
Exactly.
Yeah, awesome. I love it. Great. And so we've got another about 10 or so minutes. And if you have more questions, keep bringing them in. But what do you think about a DE&I philosophy? I've heard there's compensation philosophies, people have their values and their mission. What is your thoughts around having a company DE&I philosophy and having that kind of I'm on the wall, but nobody has walls anymore, but somewhere that people can point to and say, this is, as an organization, this is how we believe into DE&I.
Yeah. I love DE&I philosophies. I'm a massive fan of them. I think they are incredibly powerful. And the reason is because, we have policies like how we see DE&I, or if there's, this issue, this is the process you do to report this or to manage that. But our philosophy is it's the way to bring everyone together, to get everyone on the same page of our thought, of our direction, of our path. And I find when philosophies are written really, really well, they just speak to the heart of the kind of the human nature when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think they can be incredibly powerful to synthesize the spirit of the culture and the involvement from a DE&I lens. I think they can really help just to be a compass and kind of that North Star of when we're working so hard and when we're trying to do all the things and when we're looking at how we can be more effective in DE&I and we're just so done, we look at that and we get reinvigorated all over again. I think they're incredibly powerful. I think if you're going to write one, what's really key is you want to make it seem, you want to write it from a very authentic perspective. This isn't, again, it's not a policy, it's not a rule book, but it's what does diversity mean to us? How do we identify diversity? And how do we create equitability? And how do we make sure every voice is not just heard, but it's amplified? And creating just really incredible human-focused, I think, language around the policy, but making it more heart-to-heart related, I think could be an incredible experience for a council, a leadership team, or just anyone that's focusing on DE&I, because it can be a really powerful piece.
That's awesome. That's amazing. And it's like your values. It's right. Yeah. It's that guiding principle. It's the thing that when you have really tough decisions, you can look towards and say, okay, is the decision we're making aligned with our philosophy and our values? or is the decision we're making going against that, then why are we making this decision?
Exactly.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And it's one of those things where it's gonna evolve as well. Like you're not gonna write this once and that's gonna be it. It'll probably change year over year as your company grows and changes, and new leaders step in and other leaders leave the organization. And so I think also building it with that in mind, knowing that it will evolve, and it doesn't have to be perfect the first time. I think so often as people leaders and as HR leaders, we want things to be perfect right off the bat. I know that's especially with myself. I'm going to say that I'm a bit of a perfectionist and I really want things to be perfect all the time. And so I really have a hard time of being like, no, I can change this in 6 months. That's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's true to just even how the organization's growing and how in the ways it's growing from a DE&I perspective. So making it a little fluid and flexible, I think shows that we're maturing and this needs to now reflect where we're at today.
I love it. Yeah. And it I think reinforces that like we will make mistakes. So maybe this isn't 100% correct and it can change and that's fine. We've got a great question from Rita here, which is, with having such diverse workforces, how do we celebrate, raise awareness, and educate without alienating employees in the event you miss something that is important to them? How do we get this right? And I think this comes back to that growth mindset of like, you're not going to get it right the first time, and that's okay. But how do you communicate that to your team? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, Rita, that's a great question. So absolutely, Noah, we're not going to get it right the first time. We may not even get it right the second time, but I think it's that continued growth, the continued right intention and communicating that is going to show, the actual work that we're trying to do. So I think when we're celebrating cultural events and knowing that identity is so important and really at the core of DE&I is just sharing a communication that this year we're going to be acknowledging and celebrating different cultural events, different cultural identities. This is maybe the calendar or the ones that we're going to be highlighting. If there's ones that we're missing, or there's ones that you want to participate in or help us make sure that we're spotlighting in the right way, let us know. Like invite, I think that participation, I think is really key. And then I think number two is there's some really great calendars out there now on cultural events from January to December. So from different things, from whether it's more religious holidays, whether it's cultural days, whether it's even kind of those fun cookie days like donut day or wear green shirt day or say a joke day, just things that kind of can add a little bit of levity to things as well, I think is really key. So work smarter, not harder. Utilize one of those calendars to get a really good bulk of what those events might be. Select what you think is doable from the perspective of events or recognition, because there is a lot of things to be able to do in a year, and then maybe have a rotation. So maybe this year we don't recognize it, but this year we do, and then we don't recognize it again and we spotlight something else. So there's a lot of fluid ways that you can do it, but the communication is key, because what you don't want is for employees to feel that maybe they're not spotlighting it on purpose, but that to know that we want to give a fair share to everybody, and we're going to be rotating what those events look like is also a great plan as well.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, that's what we did internally here. So we just sent out a survey saying like, hey, let us know what is important to you, what cultural holidays are important to you, what specific months or events are important to you, to your identity or to your history, and let us know. And we got some great answers, and it allowed us to build out an internal calendar of like, okay, great. Like, here's some things that we can spotlight. Here's some things we can talk about. And we've just started pulling in resources to help educate people on those things. Just like, here's a list of resources to learn more about Ramadan. Here's a list of resources to learn more about Diwali. Here's those resources to learn more about Nowruz, like different things that just mean different things to different people. And so I think just like you said, asking, it's okay to ask. We actually have a calendar that we created, so we'll throw that into the email as well, and let everyone have a look at that. We've got another question here from RB, which is, what are some action items that we can implement right away to show employees that we are taking DE&I seriously? Actions speak louder than just words. So true. Yeah. Actions do speak louder than words. So I think some of the things that you've talked about earlier about just finding what that first thing is and talking about that, maybe creating a philosophy or a council. One of the things that we did this year is we actually carved out a budget and talked about that and said that here is our annual budget for DE&I. And this is how we plan to spend some of it. If you have ideas on how we should be spending it, please let us know. And then we can look at those options as well. putting money behind something is a very
It's
good
important.
signal, yeah, that you're going to do something. What other ways have you seen that companies have done, like just that initial, like, here's the thing that we're going to do, that work
Yeah.
well?
So I think all plus one to everything you said, Noah. I think to even amplify it further, it's the continuance of the conversation. Because what I see a lot happening is like, okay, great, we're going to do this initiative, and they announce it at town hall or all hands, and then you never hear of it again once it's done. It's like, how are we continuing the conversation? How are we normalizing the topics of DE&I? So maybe every month when you do your all hands, you have 15 minutes to talk about a DE&I topic, or you have a speaker come on, or something that relates back again to the strategy, into the movement of what you're trying to create within your DE&I roadmap or action plan. So I think it's, how can we continue to speak about it? How can we continue to bring the message and make it, available to everybody? Are we talking on it on our intranets, in our emails? Are we, making sure that we're communicating it from from all levels, leadership, employees, and managers? I think that's where you're really going to start to see that kind of action piece, because it's easy to do one event and then just say, okay, great, we've checked that box. But what are we doing, 2, 3, 4 months down the road? I think is really where you're going to see employees go, okay, they're really serious about this. They're really trying, and that intention is really there.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's really easy to, like you said, tick that box and then not think about it. I think having transparent roadmaps from a HR perspective is really helpful with that as well, of just like, here are the things that we're going to be doing in the next 3 to 6 months or this quarter, and having things that are highlighted as DE&I initiatives. And then people can see that it's like, oh, they're actually going to be focusing on this next month or in 2 months.
Exactly.
And even if it's just the, like, celebrate X date or bring in speaker for this month, just having those things there to show people that it may not be happening right now, but it is going to happen in the future.
That's so important. Communication is so key. And I think I've heard this at some point or another, is that it takes someone to hear a message 7 times before they remember what the message was. So even if you're saying something, there's a very small chance that they're going to remember. So even having different touch points of that one communication, just to make sure that people are understanding, is going to go a long way as well.
Yeah. I always kind of say there's like, you can't over communicate someone in a company. It's impossible.
Exactly.
I want to jump into a few questions that we got from people who registered. I don't want to I want to touch on those ones as well, and maybe they're here, maybe they're not, but there's a couple of good ones here. So here's a good one of just like, strategies and processes for reinforcing a culture of DE&I would you recommend a small firm to implement as you scale? So what are the things that you should be doing early on as an organization? Maybe you're 10 people, maybe you're 15 people. I think a lot of what we talked about are things like that, like normalizing the conversation, having a philosophy, doing that kind of stuff. But are there specific things that you think companies should do earlier rather than later?
Yeah. One thing, and if there's only the one thing you could actually do from like an activity or an activation perspective, is doing DE&I foundational or 101 training. And I think that can be really key, because until you're aware of what these terms mean, how they intersect with one another, and how it creates the workplace culture you're trying to grow and really make come to life, you can't really truly appreciate or even fully understand how some actions are really kind of going to affect everybody. So doing some very fundamental training is, if you can only do one thing, that is what I highly encourage to do. And more than happy, as you share, know the resources, I do trainings of all shapes and sizes. So more than happy to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to see what those are about.
Awesome. And yeah, I think like you can never start too early with this type of stuff. Like just start talking about it, and start talking at the leadership level, and making sure that it's important. And even such simple things as like having a structured interview process. That's like that's such an easy thing to, well, it's not easy, but it's such a simple thing to do. That's so important for so many reasons, but also just for DE&I, of like making sure that those biases have less opportunity to show up when you're interviewing candidates.
100%. Exactly.
Yeah. So little things like that are super important and super key. Here's another question, and I'm actually really interested to hear your take on this one. Is this like, what do you see as the most advanced DE&I work any company or several are doing in this space right now? What is the apex of what we should all be trying to strive to attain? So who's doing this really well? And curious to get information on who the quote unquote winners are in this field. I don't think you can win at DE&I, but that's beside the point. Yeah.
Yeah. One organization, I haven't personally worked with them, but just from colleagues and different things that I've read from the studies, Whole Foods, they have a really, really robust DE&I and belonging program, from everything from mentorships, from professional development to training to career pathing, the way that they look at equitability within their human resource frameworks. They're just a very inclusive organization and culture. So that's one that I can remember off the top of my head at the moment. And then I think second, in terms of what is the apex we're trying to strive for? I think it's when we're really able to create an environment that allows everybody to be authentic. And I know we hear that word a lot, but in all honesty, being authentic, not having to be, afraid or fearful of retribution of anything, or feeling that they can mess up and still feel supported, feeling that they can, if they wanted one day to be CEO, that is attainable for them, not feeling that there's all these barriers. And I think being able to walk into a room and walk and talk to anybody that they want to have a conversation with, I think is really powerful. And those things seem so simple, but that's not happening today. Women walk in rooms and they can't just walk up to anybody or have the, confidence to walk up to anybody and start a conversation. Or, some people wouldn't even dare to think about being a CEO or C-level suite individual one day. So we need to break down those barriers, and we need to create and again normalize the conversation. And I think if we have a culture where we are seeing those things, we're talking these things, we're seeing career growth and opportunities for everybody, but specifically underrepresented individuals, that I think is really the apex of creating a full-formed, diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture.
That's amazing. I love it. And I think we can all strive to get there, because you're right, we're not there yet. And I think if we can do this in the sort of corporate world, as the new companies that are growing, it'll just bleed out into the rest of society. Like if we can kind of do it here, it'll have a little bit more far-reaching consequences. And I think I want to just touch quickly on that career part that you talked about, of it's okay for people to dream big and have those conversations. It's also really okay I think it's really important to make it so that employees and your team can say they want to do that and know that that's not a role at your company, and that's okay. And that they're not going to be there forever. I think that conversation needs to be normalized a little bit in organizations of people are going to leave, and that's okay.
No, it's true. And I think it's important of what we say when we do say growth mindset, or when we do say we're trying to scale or grow an organization. The talent that we have today may not be the talent we have 2-3 years down the road, and because the company isn't going to be what it was 2-3 years from now. So it's also understanding that as we grow and as we mature as an organization, as a culture, as a workforce, the people who build it and make it what it is are also going to change and shape differently as well. And that's what progress is all about. And so I think, to your point of normalizing it, it's that it's not a bad thing. There are incredible things that could come when employees move on to other opportunities, to other organizations, and then you get a new funnel of talent as well. So it's really a cycle that can allow really amazing opportunities and just a really growth mindset perspective.
Awesome. Great. And we've got time for one last question. And so this one's coming from Sarah, which is, I work at a charity that has projects internationally. Because of this, our workplace is very diverse. Our mission is also focused on underserved communities. The employees are having trouble understanding the reason behind implementing a DEI strategy. How do we get them on board?
Interesting. So if I'm understanding correctly, given that the workplace is so diverse, they're understanding why do we need a strategy in the first place. That's how kind of I'm interpreting that.
I'm seeing the same way. Yes.
Yeah. So I think the way to get them on board is the first thing that I always say in this space is that diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not a human nature for us to be intentional in this space because of our biases, because of different, structures and institutions and the way that unfortunately just the world is. If spaces aren't created for everybody to have a seat at the table, a voice at the table, or for their voices to be amplified and implemented. And so when we create a DE&I strategy, it starts to break down mindsets, constructs, and ideologies that are preventing those great ideas from really being surfaced and creating the psychological safety of a organization to really come to life. So the strategy and the reason is because it creates intentionality, it creates visibility, and it creates intention and drive and a mission to what we're really striving to create. Because we can have all the diversity in the world when it comes to, the way our people are in the organization. We can, when you have two different people in a room, essentially that's human diversity. But there's so many different diversity dimensions that we haven't even begun to explore that, again, aren't being spotlighted, aren't being talked about, aren't even being acknowledged. And that's the things that we really need to focus on when we're doing good DE&I work. So it's creating that intentionality and that visibility.
Awesome. That's amazing. I think intention is so important, and then putting the work behind it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. So we're kind of coming up at time. And I just want to say thank you so much, Alicia, for all the amazing information and all the knowledge and frameworks and things that you shared with us today. I mean, I definitely learned a ton. I hope everybody who joined us learned a ton. And I just wanted to say thank you. And I also wanted to give you a little opportunity to talk about Culture Shift a bit and, what you're up to.
Yes, thanks, Noah. Well, it's a busy time here. As mentioned, myself and my firm, we do diversity training, we do consulting, program management, and we ebb and flow with the way that our clients and their organizations are kind of growing and scaling. So if you're looking for a DE&I partner, someone to help, walk through some key processes, build trainings, build that strategy, build that philosophy, that's what Culture Shift HR is here to do. And so also reach out to me. My LinkedIn is in the video, as well as, I can drop it in the chat as well. Reach out, connect, let's have a conversation. We'll make sure to share some resources as well, Noah, so that people have access to those. And really, let's just continue the conversation, because with all of us here, we can be change agents. We are change agents, and now we just got to do the work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I wanted to, say thanks again, and thank you all for attending. Like this is one of the steps that you can be taking in your DE&I journey, is just learning more and listening to people like Alicia who, have the knowledge and the frameworks and the processes that can help us, on this journey, get to the places where we want to go. The one thing I also wanted to talk quickly about on the Gusto side, because this is a Gusto webinar, we've got a little something called Culture Stars here at Gusto. So culturestars.gusto.com. And as a recognition company, we want to help you recognize your key employees, your key team members, and what they're doing. So you go to Culture Stars, you nominate one of your star employees or something that they've done that's really incredible, and we'll give you a $50 Gusto gift card to give to them. And then we're going to be finishing off this quarter with a nice big awards ceremony. We're going to be bringing in a couple of HR leaders to help me look at some of these nominations and submitting a $500 grand prize to a winner. So check it out, nominate some of your key people, and we hope to see you at our next webinar coming up in April. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thanks,
have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.